Jeff Durkin with We Are Change Connecticut out here at Judson Memorial Church in New York City, and we're joined by one of the guests at the panelists for this event tonight in the launch of No Separate Justice. Would you mind introducing yourself and tell us why you're out here today?
My name is Pardiss Kebriaei. I'm a senior attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, and I was here to talk about a campaign that we're launching called No Separate Justice, the purpose of which is to bring attention to rights violations and inhumane treatment and torture that's happening right here in the context of domestic terrorism prosecutions in the United States that have received far too little attention. As someone who's worked on Guantanamo for years and has been part of a worldwide movement really to close that prison, it's past time that we start paying attention to the injustices that are really happening in the context of these cases here. So the panel was really to announce this campaign, and part of it is going to be vigils monthly, every Monday, every first Monday of every month, vigils outside of the Metropolitan Correctional Complex in New York and in Lower Manhattan. We're going to stand outside and try to make some of this visible.
Maybe just a background on yourself and getting involved. What got you started? What was your particular turning point for being involved with the Center for Constitutional Rights and covering these important issues? Kind of the background on that.
So I got involved, like I said, I started at CCR about 6 years ago to work specifically on the cases of men who were detained at Guantanamo. And about 3 years ago, actually at an event in January marking another year of detention at Guantanamo, I met the father of Fahad Hashmi, who is a young man who is now incarcerated at the Supermax in Florence, Colorado, on very broad charges of material support for terrorism, which is one of the ways that these prosecutions happen very unfairly. But I met Mr. Hashmi, and I was there talking about arbitrary detention and torture of people at Guantanamo and not really paying that much attention to ways that arbitrary detention and torture and secrecy are happening here. And so that meeting was actually my introduction in a real way to cases here. And I began representing Fahad. At the time, he had already gone through his criminal process. He had been, like I said, charged with material support for terrorism on allegations that he had stored luggage containing socks and ponchos that was later delivered to Al-Qaeda. That was his crime. And for that, he faced a potential of 70 years in prison. He was held for 3 years pre-trial at the MCC, which we're going to be standing outside of, in solitary confinement under things called special administrative measures, which are another layer of restrictions on the ability of a person in prison to communicate with anyone on the outside. So he was held in those conditions for 3 years, facing potential 70-year sentence, and the eve of his trial, he actually pled to 1 count of material support. So he was convicted in that way, sentenced to 15 years in exchange for the plea, and he's now incarcerated at ADX. So when I met Mr. Hashmi, the family was looking for help in challenging Fahad's current conditions of solitary confinement at the Supermax. And I got involved, and I'm still involved, and our goal is to get him out of ADX. Conditions at ADX are 22 to 24-hour solitary confinement. It's torture for anyone. It's a torture prison. I'm specifically working on Fahad's case. He has no place there at all. I mean, the prison should shut down, but Fahad in particular needs to be moved out of there. So that's what we're working on now.
You mentioned the secrecy in the panel discussion, how it's closed off for journalists, for people who are interested in the case. You mentioned you visited Guantanamo Bay as well and other prisons. Maybe describe your experiences at those prisons and how basically you were treated representing these cases.
So yeah, I talked about secrecy tonight, and one of the ways that what I experienced at Guantanamo is really replicated in the domestic context is in this way, which is that when I go to Guantanamo and I meet with a man detained, everything that he tells me is presumptively classified. So when I leave, all of my notes about our meeting are deemed classified, and then they go through a review, a classification review, And the government decides what can be made public and what has to stay secret. And that process ends up leaving out a lot of stuff that I would want to say about the treatment of my clients, how they're doing, their conditions, the effects of their detention. So there's a lot that gets filtered out, but there's some portion that I am able eventually to talk about publicly that's cleared. It's still very difficult, so that's part of the secrecy. In the domestic context, under SAMs, these special administrative measures that I was talking about, which Fahad was under, everything that happens in a meeting between an attorney or a family member and that prisoner is deemed protected. Not necessarily classified, but still secret, protected. And so when an attorney or a family member leaves that room, they are gagged from speaking about what happened in that meeting, what they observed of the person, what the person said about how they're doing, their conditions. There's nothing that leaves that room. And what's actually slightly worse about SAMs that there's no process for ever clearing for public use any part of that. So a concrete example is, I could go to Guantanamo, meet with a client, and I'd have to wait a couple of weeks to be able to talk about that meeting, but I could sit on a panel here and talk about that meeting. If I went to a meeting with someone under SAMs, or like Fahad when he was under SAMs, I would leave that meeting and I would never be able to talk about it on a panel. None of that information about what the person had said, what I'd observed, what their conditions were, what their treatment was, how they were doing. There was none of that I could ever talk about. So that's one way that secrecy happens. And then the other, separate from SAMs, is that at places like ADX, where Fahad is, access is extremely restricted. So there is no journalist that I'm aware of so far who's been allowed inside the prison to meet with a prisoner. It's the same at Guantanamo. And we talk about secrecy at Guantanamo. We never talk about the secrecy of places like ADX. The UN expert on torture, whose mission it is to investigate torture in prison facilities, has requested repeatedly to go to ADX and meet with Fahad and meet with other men detained to hear for himself what their conditions are and how they're doing, and he's so far been denied. So it's really, in that sense, in terms of public access, exactly the same thing at Guantanamo as happens here. We just don't recognize it here.
I'm not sure if it was you or someone else that mentioned how, since there's only small amount of cases that you guys talked about tonight. I think you mentioned it was hiding in plain sight, or someone mentioned that, about how there's so many more cases out there of people, basically innocent Americans being detained under the post 9/11 laws and all of that, with the FBI informants and stuff like that. How really, has there been more of a trend where people are more knowing about what's going on, or do you see more of a clampdown on that with different, people knowing about it?
I think the numbers here tonight at our event, it's a really cold night in New York. I think the numbers here indicate alone, that there is interest and people are paying more attention and they're wanting to get involved. I think that there's still, in terms of just mass media anyway, very little attention paid to these cases, and the way they are covered is in the most superficial way. There's coverage of the nightly news about someone's arrest, about what they're charged with. There's a lot of inflammatory talk, press conference by government officials announcing the arrest. At the end, announcement of a conviction, but there's not much below that surface. So I still think we have a long way to go to really understanding what's beneath those press releases and those convictions. The government says over 500 people who've been prosecuted on terrorism charges since 9/11, over 400 convicted. Of those 400, what does conviction mean? Of those 400 convicted, how many were pleas? What were the charges? What was the process? These are questions we need to be asking at a minimum and as a starting point.
Where can people learn more even about the Center for Constitutional Rights or any of the organizations that are mentioned tonight? No Separate Justice, that you mentioned the start of that, for more people to learn about it, to get involved where they are in their local area?
So No Separate Justice, we have our own website. It's noseparatejustice.org. You can go to that website and find out more about these cases that we're talking about and what you can do. So the Center for Constitutional Rights is part of that campaign. We have our website as well. It's ccrjustice.org. You can go to our website and find out more about the work we do in this area and other areas, and there are actions that people can take to get involved. So I would say, start with going to those websites and finding out more.
It's a quick header. You can find the full story in the background at www.freetariq.com. But to provide a brief synopsis of it, my brother and I were born and raised here. We grew up much like any other youth here in the U.S.
I personally, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and other people who understand what's going on support truth tellers like Jeremy Hammond, Bradley Manning, Aaron Swartz, and Julian Assange.